South Sudan's first Vice President Taban Dengai has assured the General Assembly that the South Sudanese government has consented to the provisions of Security Council Resolution 2304. That resolution authorizes an expanded peacekeeping force to bolster civilian protection efforts. Remember, the country has been engulfed in a recent crisis following disagreements between forces loyal to President Salva Kiir and former Vice President Riek Machar.
Addressing the General Assembly, the first Vice President of the Republic of South Sudan, Taban Dengai, made confirmations that the South Sudanese government has agreed to the arrangements of Security Council Determination 2304, which approves an extended peacekeeping power to reinforce regular citizen assurance endeavors. Dengai made promises to bring peace, justice, and rebuild strong and credible institutions for the country.
The Republic of South Sudan will cooperate with UNAMIS, the regional bodies, IGAD, EAC, AU, Troika, EU, and all our friends in a journey towards recovery from the tragedy that befell us.
It's a number of points that were raised by somewhat contradictory, maybe, statements from Juba, but we are watching this very closely, and you may be sure that the Security Council is indeed watching very, very closely, because they expect, and I think it was said so, that the government of South Sudan does uphold the commitments it made in that joint communique. When you agree to something, you have to live to your promises.
Center territorial and universal accomplices of the South Sudan peace process met to trade views on how best to propel the political procedure and make the required political conditions for the effective usage of the United Nations mission in South Sudan Command. Participants urged the transitional government of national unity to cooperate fully and without further delay with the deployment of the UN mission's Regional Protection Force as a key operational enabler to this process, and agreed that continued impediments to the UN mission freedom of movement are not acceptable and must end.
Well, let's bring some cheer to Africa as U.S. President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama did officially open the new Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., before an audience of former presidents and stars, including Oprah Winfrey and Will Smith. Former President George W. Bush also took to the stage, thanking his wife, Laura Bush, who sits on the board of the museum. The ceremony ended with the President Barack Obama and the First Lady standing along with the Bonner family, who included 99-year-old Ruth Bonner, the daughter of a slave. A group rang a historic bell from the First Baptist Church in Virginia, one of the oldest black churches in America, founded under a grove of trees in 1776. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture is the 19th and the newest of the Smithsonian museums. It was designed by an architect who has African heritage, David Ajayi.
This weekend, we'll dedicate the newest American icon on our National Mall, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It's a beautiful building, 5 stories high and some 70 feet below the ground, situated just across the street from the Washington Monument. And this museum tells a story of America that hasn't always taken a front seat in our national narrative. As a people, we've rightfully passed on the tales of the giants who built this country, but too often, willful or not, we've chosen to gloss over or ignore entirely the experience of millions upon millions of others. But this museum chooses to tell a fuller story. It doesn't gauze up some bygone era or avoid uncomfortable truths. Rather, it embraces the patriotic recognition that America is a constant work in progress, that each successive generation can look upon our imperfections and decide that it is within our collective power to align this nation with the high ideals of our founding. That's what you'll see inside.
U.S. President Barack Obama talking about the museum. Barack Obama himself has African heritage, his father being a Kenyan and his mother being an American. VOA's Haid Fitzgerald joins us now from Washington. Haid, glad to have you on Network Africa.
Thank you very much, Amarachi.
It must be a thing of pride, Haid, for the African American community to finally have this museum, right?
Indeed, Amaraji, and that was truly evident over the 3 days, this festival of freedom sounds surrounding the opening of the museum. As you had mentioned earlier, this was really a star-studded event. We saw Stevie Wonder, Patti LaBelle, The Roots, Living Color, really a star-studded lineup. And some of the highlights included the historic bell ringing by the daughter of a slave, and of course President Obama's speech. There were some really poignant moments in his speech when he talked and touched on themes of unity and understanding. And as you know, the opening of this museum comes at a time when racial tensions are really high in the United States, following some high-profile shootings of African Americans involving the police. So another poignant moment was when President Barack Obama said that Americans of African descent are not a burden or a stain on America. They're not a symbol of pity or shame. He said, we are America. Adding that, he hopes this museum will really help explain that. And the museum is one of its kind. It is exclusively focused on African American life, but organizers have gone out of their way to be very inclusive, saying that this really is America's story.
Well, I can imagine the pride welling up in the hearts of the African Americans who were there to witness the opening of the museum. But what does this really mean to their African heritage? What do you find in the museum?
Well, let's first start with what is in this amazing museum. The $540 million museum. You can see the dress that Rosa Parks was sewing just before she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a segregated bus. A hymn book and a shawl by abolitionist Harriet Tubman, and shackles used on a child slave. A couch, some clothing from the set of Oprah Winfrey, and of course one of the very famous fedoras worn by Michael Jackson. But the intention here really is to recognize and celebrate the contributions of Americans of African descent in the making of America into what it is today. The museum is, though, also meant to really chronicle their hardships over time. Many tourists come here to Washington, D.C. To come and see the Smithsonian museums. For school students in America, it's almost a rite of passage to come see the White House, to see the Capitol, and then the Smithsonian museums. And many people were telling us that museum was the one building that has always been missing from Museum Row. And so they say this museum finally completes a very, very important part of the American story.
Well, I'm one of those people who was looking forward to the completion of that museum. I was in Washington some time ago, and I practically wanted to really see it. So it's great to know that we can come back to that. But let's talk about the architecture and the person behind it. David Ajayi, who happens to be an African or has of African descent. We understand. Was he also at the opening, and did he say what this means to him to have designed this building?
You're right, he has Tanzanian roots. He was born in Tanzania. He's a British and Ghanaian architect, and his firm was commissioned to, of course, design the building. The Smithsonian really liked his idea of this sort of dark presence on the mall. And he said, though, he spoke ahead of the opening, and he said he was very worried, knowing that, it takes about 10 to 12 years to actually build a museum, a Smithsonian museum. He was worried that this museum would not be opened by President Barack Obama. It wouldn't happen in his time. Of course, they managed to finish this in 8 years, and so how fitting then that America's first president of African descent was able to officially open this building, designed by a son of Africa. So those were very, very sweet moments.
I would love to continue this conversation with you. I'm so interested in the African American Museum, but thanks a lot for joining us on Network Africa.
My pleasure.
And as we continue the program, reporters in Egypt say a survivor recalled the shipwreck off the coast of Egypt's northern province of Beira, caused by overloading that left over 400 illegal migrants dead on September 21st. The survivor, surnamed Mutawali, told the China Central Television that he when he was dropped onto the ship by a speedboat, he, quote, learned that some stowaways had stayed on the ship for several days when they embarked because he was sending more to join them. The speedboat left soon after it dropped us onto the ship. Not long after, the ship started to tilt left and right as the ship was overloaded with too many people. Mutawalli is one of the 175 migrants who were lucky to have been rescued. He did lose his wife and children, though. He said he knew it was dangerous to get on a smuggling ship, but life was hard for him. He had to look for other options.